Well, folks, I think we can now say with a somewhat high degree of confidence that Concord is probably going to go down as one of the biggest financial disasters in PlayStation history for a singular game release. Since there are hardware things we could talk about, but yeah, Concord as a game that Sony shipped live service PS5, PC, been out for 3 days now, and we can see over the weekend it has done terrible. Which the headlines are all hinging on that one singular number that's being discussed left and right, and it's the Steam peak player count on a 24-hour rolling basis, or the highest number that the game had, which typically does happen during the first 24 hours of a game coming out, which is why people use that as a decent benchmark for how well the game did, and that did not even cross over 1,000 players. And that should not even be too shocking, given that during the open beta period, where there was no barrier of entry to hop in and try the game out, that barely crossed over a little over 2,000. So the writing was already on the wall, but I guess it's just more illustrative of really how bad the game is doing right now, when you can also look at other examples of games that are maybe even not nearly as good or not as technically sound. Like Suicide Squad was a big, well-known disaster that only got up to like 12, 13,000 for a peak player count. Redfall, well known for being, well, I don't want to say objectively here, but I think it's one of those games where a lot of people tend to agree it's like an on paper actually bad game, not just in terms of the moment-to-moment gameplay, but also it's just kind of buggy and not a great experience to go through, and just a very problematic game, which there's a lot of history that goes into why that game came out the way that it did, right? It's just, but it's like that game also was able to do a few thousand versus Concord, which on paper is a very technically sound game from a studio that is comprised of a lot of talented people. That's the other aspect of it too, right? I mean, Firewalk, while it is a new, unproven studio, a lot of the former staff are long-term vets in the game's business. That and this kind of goes back to a headline we talked about on Friday, which was it's been in development for 8 years, and therein lies the problem, right? It's a very big financial risk for really any studio, any publisher, to invest millions and millions and millions of dollars to make this over such a long period of time. And it's even more risky when you consider that trends do change. I mean, in 2016, I'm sure a lot of people across all spectrums of decision-making that ultimately got us to where we are today had this pie-in-the-sky idea of like, oh, well, look at all these hero shooter games that are out right now doing incredibly well. Why don't we do something like that? Now it's more a matter of carving out your own path and coming up with your own identity for the kind of project that you think would do well, maybe lean into more asymmetry, come up with your own, obviously, character designs and things like that, which is what's getting into the weeds of the grander talk about why Concord is not doing so well right now. And we're not even necessarily here to do that, because it's already being discussed across the spectrum here. It kind of runs the gamut in terms of what people think about this game and why it's doing bad. A lot of it is, the character designs, they look bland, or it's the price point being a problem. And so there's a number of things we can say about that. I mean, full stop, the game's not doing well. So clearly there's a lot of arguments to be made about why the game is doing so bad. But I think what's more a fascinating thing to really analyze, at least in the context of this channel, because we cover the PlayStation business, I mean, this is a game we've been following for a very long time. I mean, as early as we knew about it, which was 2021, when Sony made a more formal announcement about them, signing on this game for a publishing agreement with Probably Monsters and Firewalk the studio, and then eventually acquiring the studio and then bringing them in-house and seeing this game all the way through. But that's the portion that I think is worth really analyzing here is, okay, this was a big financial risk. And I mean, that's kind of what we always want, right? I mean, this is what's so complicated when we look at Concord and I think discuss it fairly, which is not really happening a whole lot right now. It is very much a dog pile, but I also don't want to, err on this side of like guilt tripping people or whatever the case is, right? This is not me about to go on a spiel about how it's a new IP, it's unproven, a new studio, look at what Sony's investing in. I mean, we should be supporting devs. It's not one of those things where it's like a guilt trip. I mean, I checked out on this game immediately. I was very open about that right when we finally figured out what the game actually is, a 5v5 hero shooter. Immediately I was like, okay, I'm checked out. This is not the kind of game for me. But that would have been my attitude, whether the game did good or bad. Clearly the game is a misfire, and I'm not sure if I would say that's earned, but it's, the marketplace does what it does. If people don't want this game, then there's really no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They can't just make that work. On the other side, you had Helldivers 2, where I thought for certain that game was not going to do well. As a very niche PlayStation IP that Sony, that was also a big risk. We actually learned from Arrowhead's recent presentation earlier this year that that game was also in development for like 8 or 9 years, and like halfway through, Sony doubled the budget for Arrowhead to really get that game out the door and make it look and play the way that it does. And that's one of those very big, unproven financial risks that worked. I mean, arguably, Helldivers 2 was a new IP because damn near nobody played Helldivers 1 on Steam, PS4, 3, and PlayStation Vita of all things, right? So it's one of those just very big financial bets. And I would argue, and this is what I'm kind of getting at here, I would argue that's how I would want them to go about doing it. I'm seeing a lot of discussion right now with this game now doing poor, is this sort of celebration of sending a message to Sony or sending a message to other big publishers, and that this is what we don't want. And I can understand where people are coming from to a degree. I mean, there's been a lot of fatigue with live service games in general, right? I mean, live service here, MOBA shooter, hero shooter, they're free to play, but then they might be very predatory and have all these different season passes over time. So God forbid you enjoy these games, you're actually going to be spending more long term versus the more standard boxed multiplayer that people are asking for us to go back to, which is still just not really a thing for a lot of studios because they don't really see the value, since games can be monetized a lot further if they are these sort of forever games that many publishers are willing to chase and risk investing tons of money in, because God forbid one does hit, then it pays for all those failures and then some. But with Concord and also Helldivers 2, these games are $40 up front. And like I said, with Helldivers 2, it's basically a new IP given the circumstance. But I would make the argument, I still think that's more preferable in the here and now versus maybe all the other sort of counter arguments I've been seeing the last 2 days, especially those in particular from more of the core PlayStation audience. It comes up a lot, which is the obvious pushback against live service. And again, I understand these kind of games are just not for me too, but I always say time and time again, Sony is not walking away from single player games. They're not dumb. They like making money. That's why most of PlayStation studios right now are still making single player titles, and Sony has been going about this in a very strategic way, which is, going outside of the PS Studios in-house bubble, partnering up with Firewalk or Lucid Games, or also Haven, Firesprite, Firewalk, and then some of those studios got brought in, but they were still at the time outside studios that were new investment in addition to what they were doing so far, which that is the way to do it. And it's also inherently not a problem, I find, which is trying to revisit multiplayer. In this case, in the current environment, 2024, it's live service. But this was a gap in Sony's portfolio throughout a good portion of the PlayStation 4 lifecycle. And I remember at the time, that was something where folks were kind of wondering and even reminiscing, man, Sony should maybe go back and do multiplayer again like they did during the PlayStation 3 cycle. They had a lot of multiplayer games back then. Now, granted, they were the standard, boxed multiplayer that you'd pay, an upfront fee, or would have single player with multiplayer tacked on, and they were more arena-style shooters. And I know a lot of the complaints tend to be oh, let's go back to that. Which, as a little caveat here, I'd even argue that games like Helldivers 2 and even Concord can still be played and enjoyed that way, because they are atypical in that they are asking for a $40 fee up front, and then all the content is guaranteed free from that point forward, or at least for a while. They still monetize it in certain ways outside of that, but in theory, you're paying the $40 up front and getting a lot of content right then and there. And even though there's the expectation that it has to be this sort of forever style game, you can still pay $40 for both of those games and get 20-30 hours out of it. And why is that not somewhat equivalent to the same, arena style multiplayer you had in 2011 on PlayStation 3? So, I mean, I would make that argument, but anyway, the point is, there's nothing wrong with them investing in multiplayer. If they're going to go about doing it, then I would make the argument that Concord, despite it being a massive misfire, there's simply no denying that. Again, the game is not for me, and it's not doing well. I would rather have that than this sort of other answer that I'm seeing people shoot out there in light of Concord, going, well, why don't they just revisit an IP, an older IP like, SOCOM or Resistance or Killzone, or what about MAG or Warhawk, right? And I can't shake off the feeling that is such a bad idea. It's like asking for something that you clearly don't want, and it's a worse outcome. I would rather have investment into an outside new studio, them experiment with new IP. Again, whether it lands or not is its own isolated thing. I'll always vouch for new IP, even if it does turn out bad, but I would rather see that outcome versus a well-known single-player studio now tied up in live service, and also they're taking a beloved franchise that people know as a single-player game and it being turned into live service. We don't want that. How are we even humoring the idea that would have been a better outcome, right? And we know Sony does cancel projects. They are not afraid to do this. They just recently had a culling of their portfolio, and one of them in there was a Twisted Metal live service game at Firesprite. Also, The Last of Us Online, which that is our one big example where there is some kind of alternate timeline out there where they went ahead and got that game out the door, and then they turned into a live service studio, and then they never had the resources ever again to do single-player games, right? I'm not sure if that's really what we want when we think about the answers to Concord, or what Concord should have been, or if Sony's going to do multiplayer, it should be X, Y, and Z thing that maybe sounds good in theory, but we all know would maybe not pan out all that well. I mean, that's the other big problem here, is that Sony still just doesn't really talk nearly as much as they used to nowadays. We know they have multiple single-player projects in the pipeline. We're expecting them to finally say something fairly soon for either a state of play or a showcase. I'm seeing some argue that, hey, maybe if they did talk more about the single-player games, then Concord wouldn't feel as much of a burn. And I think that's fair. But it's always like the same argument we make, which is the problem is Sony doesn't talk nearly as much anymore because they don't show up to Paris Games Week, TGS, Gamescom, E3. These were always press events that we could count on them showing up, and they would always talk about something, and nowadays they just simply do not do that. So that's an issue too that really gets into a separate topic. But I think we'll just end it here, right? I think I've gotten to the primary point, which is, look, they're not going to stop, but they've gone about it in a way where if we're going to have a big financial disaster, I guess this is how I would have preferred it to happen versus maybe some of the other answers that are floating around out there. No matter what, even if new IP fails, I want new IP. So I hope this doesn't deter them from doing more new IP, even if it is, live service games. They're not for me, but I would rather that happen than doubling down on familiar IP that has to get turned into something that we maybe definitely would not want to happen. So with that said, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation, and I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.